Hello, everyone. We will get started in just a moment. I know there are a few individuals that are still logging on, but we thought we could take this opportunity to welcome you all to our second module of the Interagency Training on Disability Inclusion in the 2021 Humanitarian Program Cycle. My name is Kimberly Leitz. I work with the Assessment, Planning, and Monitoring branch of OCHA Geneva and will serve as your moderator today. I have had the good fortune to work with colleagues from UNICEF, UNHCR, WFP, and IOM with expertise on this topic who have developed the content and the format of this training. Our facilitators today will be Ahmed Ghanem, Kirsten Lang, and Steve Perry of UNICEF. We have had an overwhelming response to this training, well beyond what was expected. And at last count, I believe it was more than 160 individuals indicating a desire to join one of the 3 sessions which have taken place over last week and this week. We have a relatively short 90 minutes with you today, given the breadth of the topic that we seek to cover. So we do kindly ask for your patience if we run a few minutes long. I can assure you that we will very much endeavor to stick to time. We know that everyone is quite busy at this point in time. So although our group is large, we will try to keep the sessions lively and interactive. I would like to encourage you to post on the chat space. We will be monitoring it. So if you have a question or a suggestion, please do share it with the group. We will be answering questions sporadically throughout the session, but we have also specifically set aside time at the end so that we can have some discussions on the questions and the suggestions that are put forth. The session will be recorded, and the cloud link, as well as the presentation, will be posted following the session so that you will have access to it. My thanks to all of you who took the 10-minute pre-test quiz on SurveyMonkey. There will be a post-session follow-up quiz in order to try and assess the success of this training. So we will ask you to complete a short session feedback at the end of today. As many of you were with us for the first module, and if you were not, we do hope that you had the opportunity to read through the guidance and listen to one of the recorded sessions. But for those of you who were with us, you know that the focus on Module 1 was very much on understanding the key definitions and some of the conceptual elements related to disability work and where it sits within the humanitarian program cycle. Today, we shift more to the practical application, starting with a presentation of the practical issues of what disability inclusion should look like within the HPC, where it will sit. And we'll follow with some mini case studies which aim to provide insight into addressing some of the challenges that we heard from you as being things that you have to deal with your disability work on a regular basis. We'll look to you to engage on answering some questions about that. And then we will close our 90 minutes with what we hope will be a very robust question and answer session. With that, I will hand over to my colleagues Ahmed and Kirsten to go ahead with the first part of the session. Over to you guys.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you now, Ahmed.
So sorry. I have a problem with my microphone. Thank you, Kim, for your introduction. As Kim said, we will start today discussing two options or two things: the disability inclusion with humanitarian need overview and disability inclusion and humanitarian response plan. Starting with disability inclusion and humanitarian need overview, we will focus on the document itself, how to ensure that every section in the document have an disability inclusion when we producing this document. This is important document. First of all, I should refer that this is a very important document, humanitarian need overview, as a part of a humanitarian program cycle. And starting from the first part of it, which is the summary of humanitarian need and the key finding, which is the most important section and the first section, we need to ensure that in our key finding, we have the segregation of total number of people in need by disability. This is one. And we need also to understand the concern and priorities of persons with disability. So any document of HNO should at least have in its key findings these two elements. And then when the document itself discusses the humanitarian consequence, we need to describe the specific or what kind of risk are faced by subgroup of population due to disability. And here we are focusing on the risk as we will discuss later on. And then we should also report what kind of capacities and the coping mechanisms are used by a person with disability. When we go to the second part, or the part related to impact on the crisis, we need to understand that this part have four elements, which is the first element is the context of the crisis itself. And in this part, we need to ensure that we have at least describing what kind of key problems facing persons with disability, how the crisis impact differently on persons with disability. And this is very important because yes, the crisis is impacting all the population in the affected area, but sometimes it have a different impact on persons with disability, and we need to highlight this different impact in order to respond in the right way. Also, we need to understand what kind of factor, as we said in the first part, is contributing to increase this risk. And the most important, what kind of priorities and needs of from their perspective, persons with disability themselves. The second part is the human consequence, or what we call it the causal factor associated with this need. And in this case, we need to identify persons with disability as a subgroup and reflect to which extent this group of persons with disability have diversity and intersectionality. And here we will go through it very quickly because it's take more time, of course, to discuss that, but we will focus on it in very quick way. First, we will start by disability-related factor and started to see to which extent this disability-related factor and barriers that is facing the person with disability is interacting with two other things. First, the contextual factors that is related to context and the crisis. And the second, structure inequality that is existing, age, gender, ethnicity, religious. So the disability itself and the barriers facing person with disability is interacting with other two factors to reduce a completely different consequence of crisis on person with disability and increase the risk of person with disability. And that's why we need to ensure that when we do this analysis, we understand that. For example, if we are doing this analysis for women with disability, we will face that the gender, which is structural inequality, will interact with the disability factor and barriers that is facing disability in the contextual factor, for example, flood, war, conflict factors that and increase the crisis for persons with disability or the risk for persons with disability. Then we have two other important topic, which is the severity of humanitarian need. When we do that for the full population, we should understand how the disability is impacting, and of course the related factor of disability is impacting the humanitarian consequence and need. And the last one, usually in this part, we identify number of persons in need. And in this case, as we said, we should highlight that this number segregated by disability. How many persons with disability among this person in need that we will cover? This is one. And usually the most important question, and of course we will discuss that later on in our scenario-based study, but we usually want to estimate how many persons ability among the person in need in our document. And in this case, we usually advise that first of all, if we will do a primary data collection in the context itself, we should ensure that disability data are collected through including some tools that is focusing on disability, like Washington Group set of questions and the other tool. This is one. The second, in principle, where data on age and sex are collected, usually we should collect also the segregated data by disability. Then the last part, when we don't have a primary data collection or we don't have ability to collect primary data, usually we use the secondary data source. And in this case, we should ensure that the secondary data source are reliable, like administrative data or national prevalence. And also we should ensure that if we don't have this reliable data, or the data is very old or not valid anymore due to the context, we should use the global estimation, which is 15% of population are persons with disability, but we also need to adjust it as needed. And we should remember in this context that in humanitarian context, number of persons with disability usually significantly higher than the global average, because this global average have been calculated in all contexts, which is developed context, developing context, and humanitarian context. Moving to the second part, usually we have another very important part in humanitarian need overview, which the first is risk analysis. And when we do that and we need to ensure that disability inclusion is existing in this part, we need to have two common points in our mind. First, can we describe the risk context that persons with disability face? What kind of risk persons with disability face in this situation? And then we need also to understand what is the perspective of disability person organization or other local international NGO working with disability and the person with disability point of view themselves. Our analysis will be very important, of course, but the perspective and the participation of persons with disability in this analysis is very crucial to understand the risk. And the second part, when we design our monitoring of situation and needs that will be used during the analysis and during the year that we will cover in HNO, we should identify how humanitarian consequence will be evolving for persons with disability. If we expecting, for example, there are a conflict in area and we expect that due to physical barrier, persons with disability will face more risk, we should anticipate that in our monitoring of situation and needs. Also, we should understand to which extent the access to assessment and other factors will increase persons with disability. Sometimes we calculate that if we have an assistant in the country, and this assistant will reduce the risk for the population, for example, distribution of food. And at this point, we should understand to which extent persons with disability will benefit from this assistance and I will be able to access it, and then to which extent this will affect the risk that is faced by persons with disability. The second, our last point, is in order to reflect the consultation that we should do with persons with disability and our monitoring and situation analysis. Then we have another big part of humanitarian need overview, which is sectorial analysis, when we have a specific chapter for every sector or cluster, WASH, education, health, and so on. We need to ensure that in every cluster, in every sector that we cover, two important description in our work. How the crisis impact differently persons with disability as we discuss, and this should be, I will say, connected directly to the cluster that we are talking about, and what kind of factor contributing to heighten the risk for person with disability. For example, if we are doing, for example, one of our risk identified or described as we seen in the last year humanitarian need overview, we see some countries that write, for example, that person with disability experience a high impact of food shortage more than others. This is a good description to some extent. However, it should be reformulated to ensure that the risk and the factors that increase the risk are identified inside. In this case, we advise that, for example, instead of just saying that persons with disability are more affected by impact of food shortage, we should say that due to limited access to land and due to disability-related discrimination increase, the risk of food insecurity and malnutrition of persons with disability will increase. In this case, the difference between two, that in the second one, we mention what kind of factor lead to this risk. Without doing that, it will be very difficult to design a response that is solving this risk or reducing this risk. And this is one, of course, example, and we have several other examples. For example, the same. If we are discussing that person with disability is exposed to a situation of insecurity, this is good to say, but this is the risk. What kind of factor lead to this risk? We can identify that in this situation, person with disability, due to physical and communication barrier, they cannot escape to safe area or fleeing to safe area easily as other population. Going to the other section, which is the annexes, which is the last part of humanitarian need overview. Even in this part, we need to ensure that we consider disability. In this part, usually we discuss several issues. Most important one is the information gaps. The humanitarian team is starting to reflect to which extent that there was an information gap when he was designing the humanitarian need overview. And in this case, we strongly advise that we should reflect that maybe we need additional information for programming for person with disability. Maybe we need reliable data on person with disability if it's not already available. And in this case, we need to describe how we will collect this data in the future. And also we need to ensure if we cannot integrate data in planned need assessment, how we can do that as a dedicated primary data collection exercise in the future. And of course, we should reflect on local disability actors and how we can access this local disability actor in this area. I will move to my colleague, Kristen. Thank you, and sorry for the problem of the sound in the beginning. And of course, we will receive all the questions in the chat, and we will answer it in the end. Thank you, Kristen.
Thanks, Ahmed. Thank you very much. And thank you everybody for taking the time to join us today. I'm really looking forward to the interactive session at the end to hear some of your feedback and some of your thoughts and questions. So as Ahmed mentioned, I will be speaking about the Humanitarian Response Plan, the HRP. And the things that I'll be talking about are really based on the review that we've done of HNOs and HRPs and what we've identified in that review as some of the good practices and some of the challenges. And will also be based on the conversations that we've had with country teams on what has been effective in terms of strengthening programming. So one of the key things we found is that often there may be very good analysis at the HNO stage, but often that may not be reflected in the HRP, so it may not be reflected in the programming. So I'm going to talk about how disability can be concretely reflected throughout the whole HRP document. As Ahmed did as well, this will really just be a flying, whizzing through the document. So it'll be very brief, but what I do encourage you to do if you haven't already is to have a look at the guidance document that was shared with the invitation for this training. And that really has a lot more detail. And yeah, as has been mentioned, please feel free to pose any questions in the chat box. On to the next slide, Ahmed. Great. So I mean, one of the things that we found in our conversations with country teams was that leadership in the humanitarian country team is really essential in terms of promoting disability inclusion in programming. So translating that to the HRP as a document, there's a really great opportunity right from the start to ensure that disability inclusion is reflected in the forward by the humanitarian coordinator, that commitment is really reflected upfront. It puts us in a good position to then be able to integrate disability throughout the programming. And just a reminder, Ahmed has spoken quite a bit on the importance of disaggregating the PIN figure by disability. So in the humanitarian response at a glance section, that's also an important place to be reflecting that disaggregated PIN figure. Next slide. So in terms of the strategic humanitarian priorities, one of the things that we would really emphasize is that persons with disabilities should always be one of the prioritized subgroups. And this is reflecting that, you know, persons with disabilities make up 15% of the global population more in humanitarian contexts. And even more importantly than the numbers, we know that people with disabilities are disproportionately affected by humanitarian emergencies. So we would very much encourage that they are recognised as a prioritised subgroup. However, as Ahmed was also speaking about, what we have found is more effective in the HRPs rather than speaking more broadly about people with disabilities being prioritised or vulnerable groups being prioritised, to describe concretely how the crisis impacts on persons with disabilities. So describing, as Ahmed spoke about, those factors that contribute to vulnerability and contribute to heightened risk, including the barriers to inclusion, as well as capturing the priorities and needs of persons with disabilities as identified by them. One of the good practices that we saw in quite a number of HRPs is a specific text box that allows for a little bit more detailed description of how the response will promote inclusion of persons with disabilities. However, what we found was that text box, it doesn't need to be specific on disability. We also saw some really great examples where, for example, there was text boxes on age, gender and disability, or reaching the furthest behind. And that we found was a really good space to have some of that more detailed description. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of the strategic humanitarian priorities, this disability can really be reflected in various ways. And there's probably 2 points that I would raise here as a caution. The first one being to try to avoid describing persons with disabilities only in terms of one dimension of need. So one of the challenges we saw was that people with disabilities may only be described in relation to their health-related needs, for example. So trying to avoid doing that. And also, as has been mentioned a few times, avoiding some of those more general statements like the response will prioritise vulnerable groups. So instead of this, there's a great opportunity to talk about the impacts of marginalisation due to disability-related discrimination, talking about the obstacles to accessing humanitarian assistance, speaking about the heightened risk of violence. And that includes both GBV, but also targeted violence against persons with disabilities. That's something that we don't see described very often. We often see the heightened risk of GBV, but not so often that targeted violence on the basis of disability. Next slide. Now, while in terms of strategic objectives, while we generally don't recommend that at that strategic objective level that there is a specific strategic objective on disability, we don't generally see that as being something that is needed. But it is really important that disability is reflected in the description of each strategic objective. So explaining how the result or change will affect all affected populations, including persons with disabilities, and recognising that the impact on that group may be slightly different. In addition, what we've found in the HRPs was that it's quite helpful to have a strategic objective specifically, say, on quality or in inclusion. And that's where attention to persons with disabilities can be particularly highlighted. We also have an example in this slide, but many more examples in that guidance document that I mentioned of how strategic objectives can be framed. to really include disability. Next slide. So in terms of the response approach and costing, again, what we would really emphasize here, and it's a message that keeps recurring, but basically ensuring that the HRP describes how the response will address those factors that contribute to vulnerability. So again, avoiding these general response will prioritize persons with disabilities, will target persons with disabilities, but really describing how will that risk be reduced. So giving an example from GBV, if, for example, at the needs analysis stage, it's identified that women and girls with disabilities are at heightened risk of GBV, doing a bit of analysis of why that is. And it could be, for example, that one of the factors contributing to that risk is inaccessibility of reporting mechanisms. So in that case, at the HRP stage, it would make sense to have a strong focus on strengthening accessibility of reporting mechanisms. Now, the next point I would make around this is around the twin track approach. So in the way that we address those factors contributing to heightened risk is both through mainstreaming and targeted actions. So when we talk about mainstreaming, this means improving accessibility of everything we do. So ensuring that those reporting mechanisms are accessible, while at the same time also targeting persons with disabilities directly, for example, through outreach to persons with disabilities via organisations of persons with disabilities to raise awareness of reporting mechanisms, for example. So just a quick example there. Next slide, Ahmed. Now, in terms of monitoring and accountability, this is a huge topic and we could do a whole series of webinars just on this topic, but that's not what we have as an option. So I'm going to try and highlight just a few key points around monitoring and accountability. The first one is that what we have seen in the HRPs for 2020, which is really positive, is an increasing recognition of the need to improve accessibility of feedback and complaints mechanisms. That's been really positive. So one of the tips we would give was that in the HRP to really describe how those feedback and complaints mechanisms will be made more accessible. For example, through having multiple mechanisms for people with physical, hearing, visual, and intellectual disabilities. Ahmed already mentioned one of the other tips we have, which is to really indicate explicitly where there is a need to strengthen collection and use of data on persons with disabilities. And what we found in our conversations with the country teams was that having that explicit recognition really helped to put the issue of disability data on the agenda, which was important. In terms of the monitoring framework, so in terms of indicators, there are we would recommend again a two-pronged approach. One being to have indicators disaggregated by disability, which enables us to look at disparities in terms of access to assistance, while also having disability-specific indicators which can capture more easily those services that are delivered specifically for persons with disabilities. So taking an education example, to have, say, an indicator on percentage of children in school, having that disaggregated by disability, while also potentially having a disability-specific indicator such as number of children with disabilities reached with assistive technology to support them to access education, for example. Next slide, Ahmed. Now, in terms of the sectoral objectives and responses, there's not very much I will say specifically on this because everything that we've spoken about to date applies also at the sector level. What I would want to highlight here, however, is one of the things that keeps coming up in our conversations with country teams is the importance of not focusing in terms of disability inclusion solely on one sector, such as health or protection. But that disability really needs to be addressed throughout all of the sectors in order for a response to be fully inclusive. Next slide, Ahmed. Now, even in the HRP annexes, so Ahmed spoke a bit about the HNO annexes, so also in the HRP annexes, there's an opportunity to integrate disability in a way that is again going to put us in a good position to be able to then develop inclusive programming. So Ahmed already mentioned the need to explicitly indicate where we need to strengthen collection and use of data on persons with disabilities. In terms of the costing methodology, it's also important to highlight here the requirements for budgeting for inclusion. Now, budgeting for inclusion can include and should include both budgeting for those disability-specific initiatives like the provision of assistive technology, but also the budget needed to make all humanitarian programming inclusive. Are there additional costs, for example, for making wash facilities accessible, for ensuring access to education, etc.? So ensuring that has been factored in and considered. And there's also an important advocacy opportunity with donors under the "what if we fail to respond" section. So to really highlight there that persons with disabilities are disproportionately impacted, are one of the groups who are most left behind, and not having a fully inclusive response can have a particular impact on them. Yes, next slide. So I just wanted to finish up, like I said, very, very brief. We would encourage you again to look through the guidelines and please reach out with any questions. But just to end with the really key message that disability inclusion, it's not something separate, specialized. It's really something that is integrated throughout the humanitarian program cycle and should be very much mainstreamed in all those processes that we are already undertaking as part of the HPC. So thank you everyone for your time. Looking forward to the rest of the session.
Thanks very much to both of you, Kirsten and Ahmed. I'm not noticing any questions or comments posted on the chat, so I will gently remind the group that that is an option for you to provide feedback, comments, and to inquire about areas where you would like additional insights. Since there's no questions to address, I will pass over to Ahmed as we move on to the second component of our 90-minute session, where we ask for you to engage in some work in a scenarios-based discussion. Over to you, Ahmed.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you. Actually, we will start a scenario-based discussion. I hope it will be more interactive a little bit. We have now some sort of a scenario that I will explain to you, and then we will have some question to answer based on this scenario. We have a fictional country existing in somewhere. This fictional country have a trajectory toward peace and stability after many years of conflict, which is the situation of many countries. This progress actually have been, I will say, affected by climatic shock that could be affecting also some conflict in pocket area in the country. And this have been creating insecure environment and continuous internal displacement inside the country itself. Of course, gathering that with political and socio-economic instability that have been increased dramatically by COVID-19 pandemic have affected the situation. These complex environments that have been in this country have done some sort of complex environment for persons with disability that make them face additional barriers and risks. And most of the time they have been excluded from humanitarian assistance, and the pre-existing discrimination that is existent, the stigma have affecting them even more. Considering all these factors, and of course considering also that the country have a high level of poverty, especially for persons with disability, it's very important, of course, to identify persons with disability in order to, as a group at risk, in order to work with them. And in this case, the humanitarian coordinator of this country has committed to strengthen information on disability during this cycle of humanitarian program cycle 2021. And he said that this cycle should be considered even due to COVID-19. So what we need to do, what I need you to do, is to help this country team that is working in humanitarian need overview to ensure that their quality humanitarian response is built on understanding the real requirement and priority of person's ability during the crisis. And in this case, the question, how can we ensure that there are an accurate, meaningful information and data about disability during the humanitarian need overview process? So how we will do that? We will have a scenario. I will share it now. 1 second. This one. I hope you can see it. All of you can see it. Yes. Great. In this scenario, what we need to do is to understand or to see. I will share the link for you. I shared now a link on the chat. Could you please open it, all of you? So you will find in this link that we have here the scenario itself that I already explained and then you will have the question that we already explained, and then you have a 3 option to choose it. Read option carefully and choose one option based on your belief and based on what you think about. And when we will do that, you will have, for example, if you choose option 1, for example, and you click next, you will see that you will find 2 things. You will find the consequence, what will happen if you choose this option, and then you have 2 options. You have 2 options in this case. Either if you read the consequence here and you convinced that this is the consequence that is okay, and I'm okay with this consequence, and I think my choice, my option was very good, you click submit. Otherwise, you will click back and choose another option and then click next, and you also will read what happened in this situation. Okay, so if you please, could you start, and then we will also discuss during your work. You need any support, or everyone, did you open the link?
I'm only seeing 1 response registered, so please, I encourage you to go to the link and do to help us to get a sense of what your perspective is on with regards to this question. We'd also be very interested in learning from you in the chat what your experiences are with undertaking the HPC in the country where you may be based. Which of these options was actually pursued in the country where you're based, and you know, what challenges or advantages you found from that situation?
Yes. I can see that people start to respond. We have 5 responses now. Please try to take your time to read options and read also the consequence of every option. And in the same time, if you finish, the people that finish, the 5 that finish, please enter the chat and also tell us where are you from, your country that you are from joining, where are you joining us from now, and where is also the country that you are working with. It will be great in the chat. We are welcoming you to do that in the chat.
Yes, Ahmed, I'm noticing that this is the smallest group that we've facilitated and moderated with so far, so there is higher opportunity to really have participation and engagement. So please.
Also, to give you an idea about the choice, the first option was that primary data collection is already planned. and several need assessment and analysis tools are planned to be conducted. And in this case, we should ensure that internationally recognized method, which is Washington Group set tools in this situation, will include it to ensure that the disability will have been identified in the analysis. This is option one. And then option two, no, we will fill the gap with robust disability secondary data analysis. We will not include disability in primary data collection. We will use the available secondary data analysis, and that's it. The third option, no, actually we analyzing the low quality secondary data with waste of resources. Even we will not do that. We will not do the secondary data analysis. We will use the globally accepted estimation, which is 15% as a part of our analysis, and that's it. So you have the three options, and when you choose every one, you will find that you have a consequence. For example, if we go to option one, you will find the consequence of choosing that in the beginning. And if you back and choose option two, it will be the same situation, and we will of course discuss this option now. And option three will also lead to a different scenario. We have 10 now.
So Ahmed, in the past, we've also emphasized that there's no one right answer. And of course, the real answer that you'll encounter in the countries where you're working is maybe very much a combination of these three. But given this specific scenario, it is enlightening and insightful to see what the responses are. As we've seen in some previous discussions, everyone loves a good primary data collection exercise. So we are seeing right now a weighting towards option one. If others have different ideas, please come in now and cast your vote, because as you know, every vote counts. I'm American, so right now I have to really emphasize that cast your vote, make sure your voice is heard. It's a particularly important time.
Exactly. So we have 11 response. Anyone from the colleague that have already a response want to share with us in the chat? Where are you from? Maybe introduce yourself.
This is a very quiet group today. Oh, there we go. We've got a couple of colleagues from Lebanon. Excellent.
Great. Please keep posted your country on the chat. Thank you. So we will go through the option. I think that it's important. Thank you for choosing 12. We have 12 answers in the option. Most of the options choose option one, and I'm glad to see that. We also have some colleagues that are choosing option two, and then we have option three. So I will go through the option a little bit to discussing it. Of course, as my colleague Kim said, that there are no right answer and wrong answer. And yes, we are asking you to choose one option, but in most of the cases in real life scenario, we choose a mix of these three options to achieve the best result. First of all, regarding the option one, which is including disability tools inside primary data collection, and I'm strongly advocating for this one. Because usually when you do that, you will have a disaggregated data that will give you analytical foundation that will answer all your key questions regarding disability. So if you can imagine with me, if you have an education management information system, or you are collecting data for nutrition, if you have a specific question, 3 or 4 questions inside your data collection that is capturing who is answer, if the household or the person who is answer having disability or not, you can disaggregate all the data that you have by disability. So you can understand, for example, access to education for household that is having person with disability comparing to household who have not person with disability, and so on. This is also one of the consequence or the added value, that all the information of needs and the characteristic that you are gathering information for will be could be having a tabulation or having analysis based on disability status. And also, however, this kind of tool, you will need to allocate resources, not only financial resources, which is not very high, including that you're already doing the primary data collection, but also some human resources to ensure that you have the technical capacities to include the Washington group question. This is the consequent one. For option 2, which is depend on secondary data, and I will be honest with you, in real life, we are actually making mix between option 1 and option 2. Secondary data will remain very important, and analyzing secondary data will give us some sort of information about what kind of sources we have. But before we can do that, we need to ensure that we have enough secondary data related to disability. As you may know, most of us don't have enough information, and most of the country don't have enough data about disability as a secondary data. Also, it will be, yes, we avoid at this time the challenges of primary data collection, but unfortunately, we need to prepare analysis data plan in the same time, because even if you are depending on secondary data, the question that you are asking about disability will remain the same. So it's very important to understand what kind of data you will collect, when you will collect it, or when you will analyze it, and what is the gap that you have. Most of the secondary data, and this is very important point, most of the secondary data about disability, the data that is already there is usually old data. And most of the time is data before even the crisis happened or the humanitarian context happened. So most of it is underestimating disability, and usually you will have underestimation by disability. So you should be very careful when you use secondary data. The last one is that sometimes the secondary data are not reflecting the opinion and the current situation of person with disability after the crisis or during the crisis. So we should also consider that. One of the added value of secondary data that you are not need to collect primary data. For example, if you are not collecting primary data at all due to COVID, for example, or whatever, and this is very rare, you can use the secondary data analysis. The last option, which is not doing both of the option, which is of course not right, using estimation, the 15% estimation. In this case, I will strongly advise, don't use estimation, or use it very careful, only if you are not having primary data or you have no secondary data. And when you do so, please consider that in most of the time, you need to adjust this number to factor that the humanitarian context person with disability number is usually very high, that this estimation are global estimation. It's not reflecting at all any other data related to priorities, needs, current situation in the country, the context, and so on. The estimation also will not inform the program itself. It will not be easy to use it as to build your program or your budget, for example, or something like that. The added value is the only added value that it needs nearly no resources at all. So, like reflecting to that, you will see that sometime we will use primary data collection. In the same context, we can use secondary data collection to close the gap. And in very rare situation, we will use the estimation. Thank you. I will back to Kim again. And if you have any questions, I see that Charles and several people have sent some question. And of course, we will cover this question during the question and answer part at the end. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ahmed. I see that there are a few questions about sources and locations to find disability data. I think that's something that is obviously a very, very valid question. Let us go through the next scenario and we can prioritize that as we go into the question and answer session, because I believe some of the information that's forthcoming in the next scenario is going to contribute to an answer to that question. So please, Christelle, we are not ignoring you. We're simply allowing this to marinate a little bit and build up some anticipation before we answer that question. With that, I am going to hand over to Steve, who will be taking you through scenario 2. Over to you, Steve.
Thanks, Kim. So my name is Steve Perry. I work with Kim very closely, Kirsten and Ahmed in Geneva. And so what I'd like to do is introduce a second scenario to get you thinking about persons with disabilities in humanitarian contexts. So let's go back to this Ruritania. I see on the slide that it's a different fictional country, but it appears to be in the same place. This place, it's got a complex, protracted crisis that's been going on for a long time, involving large numbers of IDPs. And because of the ongoing war that's generated this problem, a large proportion of the population is affected by disability one way or another, sometimes acquired impairments that have been a result of the war. Sometimes there's the pre-existing ones that have were there at the beginning. If you can go to the next slide, this has led over the course of many years in this complex crisis to the emergence of a few strong, really articulate local organizations of persons with disabilities who really see this as a big emerging problem and a high priority for their country. And because this situation has been going on for such a long time, there's been an influx of a lot of humanitarian funding, and following the funding, many large INGOs, the Red Cross and others have come to prioritize programming responding to the needs of persons with disabilities. So it's a really high priority issue. Disability is a big feature of this humanitarian crisis. Now, in this scenario, as in many humanitarian contexts, what we see is that the coordination architecture for the response is two-tiered. We have a humanitarian country team, and that's a kind of high-level body that involves the UN agencies, heads of agencies probably, some donors and some selected NGOs. And this HCT is where the big strategic discussions happen, where the big strategic decisions are made. Under that and supporting the HCT is an intercluster coordination team. It's a bit more technical. It involves the cluster coordinators. It has INGOs supporting cluster coordinators. It's where sort of the planning and monitoring and some of the coordination work that is really done. So you've got these two different levels. So if you move to the next slide, we want to think about this a bit. We want to give some advice to the humanitarian country team. How best can we ensure effective humanitarian coordination and participation that supports disability inclusion within the HNO and HRP process in this second scenario? So if we were to give the humanitarian coordinators some advice, we want to somehow get the voice of persons with disabilities plugged into this process, how best to do it. So do we have a link? Ahmed, thank you for sharing the link. Click on the link and what you will see is what Ahmed brings up on the screen just now. In scenario 2, you'll see the text that describes basically what I've tried to say. And again, how to ensure effective humanitarian coordination and participation that supports disability inclusion within the HNO HRP process, select one of the following three options. Option one, the idea would be to, these are suggested pieces of advice that we could give to the humanitarian coordinator. Option one might be to establish a permanent seat on this HCT, this high level strategic level of decision making for local OPD representatives. So that's one way that we could get their voice plugged into the process. Option two, encourage clusters. A few examples of clusters I can think of would be health and protection and others. But remember, we've said that you shouldn't segregate disability into one cluster. You should build it cross-cutting across all the clusters. But encourage the cluster coordinators to build stronger relationships with local OPDs. Second option. The third option would be to identify, we mentioned in this context, there's really a lot of local organizations that have focused in on the issues related to persons with disability. So identify potential OPDs, we call them, and invest in their longer term capacity strengthening so that they become louder voices and more capable, stronger actors in terms of the humanitarian response. So there you go, you got your three options. If you click through the options, you click next, what you see is a few possible consequences of choosing that option. So read through this, the possible consequences. There's other consequences, I'm sure, as well, but read through those. Click back if you get scared off, looking at the consequences. Choose option two to see what the consequences of option two are. Again, these aren't. This isn't a perfect list, but it's some ideas to get you thinking. We urge you to sort of look at all three. Go back and let's click on option three to see there's consequences there, and then when you finally settle on what you feel is sort of the best advice to give to the HC, click submit, and then we'll see where the mood of the room is, and we'll discuss that. So off you go, everybody. How many? 5 responses so far. Excellent. We are on track.
Indeed, Steve, we're seeing some responses coming fast and furious to this one, and relatively equitably distributed. I'd be interested if anyone online from the countries they're working in has an HCT where an OPD or organization has a standing invitation to participate in the HCT. Our understanding is that is an approach that was taken in Afghanistan, so it is certainly something to consider. Let's see, how are we doing here?
I'm just chuckling. These scenarios are, Kim, are they're always going to be based a bit on sort of what we see when we look around. And we try to call them Ruritania.
Definitely.
People see through that.
They see through it right away. So interesting. We're seeing now a truly equal distribution. We have 9 responses out of just about 22 participants. Come on, guys, get out and vote.
Yeah, they've gone out for coffee. What we could do is begin discussing the three options a little bit. So option one was this permanent seat idea, and that might be legal or it might not be legal. I don't know how, in terms of the official humanitarian coordination architecture works. As I say, it was something that we discovered, or it was mentioned by some of the people we spoke to in Afghanistan as an approach that they took. One thing that comes about when you do it that way is that you certainly make a higher profile for the issue. Certainly gives a louder voice to the organization in terms of putting those views forward and keeping it on the agenda and so on. It has other consequences as well. It just logistically, it makes it important for the HCT to organize themselves and hold meetings in a way that's accessible. One of the downsides, an obvious downside, would be is the risk of tokenism. So you say, okay, box checked, the participation is occurring. And another possible issue is, of course, the issue of politics internal to civil society within that place. So people would say, well, why did that organization get chosen and not ours? Sometimes organizations see participation in that kind of forum as a way of, raising their profile and raising money even, and so there can be, competition that's not necessarily positive. Looking at option two, getting, better relationships built by the existing clusters. It can be hard for those, depending on the humanitarian context, of course. It can be hard sometimes for the UN workers and others within that world to form relationships with local organizations. We see this even more so now in COVID times, where we're working remotely and figuring out who are big players and important players within the context is difficult. Often the organizations that we would like to reach out to they're busy, they have limited capacity, limited attention, limited ability to engage. And there is also the risk of segregating and making disability sort of one cluster's responsibility. So we've seen that as well in some of the discussions that we've had with humanitarian country teams, is that they say, okay, well, disability, that's really the protection cluster should be doing that. So by sort of moving it, making the job to build relationships the job of a particular cluster, certainly would be have some downsides. Option three, organizational capacity strengthening. The idea there is that you make it easier for local organizations to engage in the system by investing in their longer term capacity strengthening. One obvious consequence of that choice is that it requires resources, and often in the humanitarian world, we are in a 1-year treadmill cycle where we don't see long term very easily. We don't have free resources to support that kind of thing. But the advantage of looking at organizational capacity strengthening is that you really do develop partners that have stronger capacity over time, and their greater experience gradually is built up, and they become more and more effective partners in the work that you're trying to do. So as with Ahmed's scenario, in this scenario, there's no right or wrong answer. I mean, all of the choices have pluses and minuses. I mean, what's I think very important though is that it's important somehow to plug in the voices of organizations of persons with disability, because they create such a powerful window into a community that's sometimes isolated or not included in mainstream processes. So figuring out the key to get them involved, I think, is really an important thing to do, and it's worth giving some thought to in terms of your own particular context. So that's what we see. Let's just go back to the pie chart for a second, Ahmed, if we can. Let's just see where we landed up. I'm curious. So it was option 3, the capacity building option, that seemed to be the most popular, with sort of a balance with the other 2. The permanent seat idea and the building of relationships. So that's great. Thanks a lot. And back to you, Kim.
Thanks very much, Steve. So we have about 25 minutes left to dedicate to thoughts and questions. And as promised, Christelle, we will go to yours first because of course this is a very pressing and pertinent comment. And so the question that Christelle has put forth is about disability data. What are the best or most current data sources? Where do you access them? Do you go to the government, WHO? Is there a database that shows us that lists where we can find these resources? I mean, I think I will pass this one to Steve, but I would note that the Center for Humanitarian Data has been working to try and collect as many sources of data, sources of disability data, and make them publicly accessible through their repository. I won't say that that is a comprehensive set of data that's available right now, but it is one source, one place to go to look. And then the guidance that was developed as well last year also lists a number of data sources. I'm quite certain that Steve has more to add on this since he has looked very closely at the disability data issue. Can I hand over to you, Steve?
Sure, thanks, Kim. While I yammer on for a little bit, I have some thoughts of where you can look. But Kim, do you mind digging out the reference to where the Center for Humanitarian Data, put the web link there? Because that's a really good starting point to look. What they're trying to do with OCHA Center for Humanitarian Data is to collect data sets from many organizations that are working, and they put them in a common place that anybody can access. And so humanitarian actors are encouraged, when they go out and do their own household survey, to put the data in this place, following certain protocols and rules and regulations about anonymity and data, privacy rights and so on. But the idea is to sort of make data that is collected available to a broader number of people. So the Center for Humanitarian Data is a really good starting place to look. I think it was Ahmed who mentioned that government censuses can be laughably out of date. I would not go, for example, to the last census done in Syria to sort of see if they did disability disaggregated data, because a lot has changed in the last 10 years. And what may have existed then, and maybe it was accurate then, isn't accurate now. So you have to be kind of cautious, I think, with local official data, depending very much on the context. In humanitarian situations, very often, as part of the HPC, the humanitarian program cycle, a step in that process sometimes is the commissioning of dedicated household surveys, multi-sector needs assessments, and other kinds of surveys that help inform what's going on in that context. Depending on the year, there can be quite a number of these going on. The place to sort of access the status of that process would be your friendly OCHA country office, who would be able to point you in the right direction to see who is working on that survey and the kinds of things that they're asking. One of the things that we'd like to see is that in these household surveys, that more and more disability disaggregated data using the Washington Group questions becomes sort of the norm in terms of how they do that. And what we're seeing is that that's happening more and more. It's not happening everywhere all the time, but it's happening more and more. One of the issues this year is that there's not going to be as many of those household surveys happening because of the COVID situation. Another great data source, but maybe qualitative data rather than quantitative data, but data nevertheless, would be the kinds of assessments and case studies that partners, particularly partners focused on the issue of persons with disabilities, do on a regular basis. Many INGOs do their own kind of assessment work. And often they look into the question of persons with disabilities. So that requires sort of a bit more groundwork and a bit more knowledge of the network and who's doing what. But very often, depending on the context, there's data in that way. OPDs can be a really good source of data. Traveling around Nepal, I found that some of the organizations of persons with disabilities there were doing their own kind of local studies within their own kind of communities of interest that were, the reference point for people working in those areas. And those are even, fall even lower under the radar than the case studies that assessments and things that INGOs would do. And the other last one that I'd mention, it's pretty exciting, is that in UNICEF's regular household survey process, they call it the multiple indicator cluster survey series, which they're in the middle of the 6th round of those. Those surveys, if you're lucky enough to be in a country where one of those mixed 6 surveys are happening, are also disability disaggregated. So they've gone out and they've used the Washington Group questions in the child functioning module, which is sort of the how you use the same approach for children, and combining that with a lot of other demographic data that those mixed surveys pick up. That's another great source, but not every country has them yet. And finally, the DHS series, the later of those, more recent ones over the past 3 or 4 years, DHS surveys are also using the Washington Group's questions as a way of disaggregating disability data. So it really depends on the context, I guess is the point. It depends on a sort of knowledge of the context, but a first place to knock on the door of would be the Center for Humanitarian Data. Over to you, Kirsten. Kim.
Thanks for that, Steve. I want to give the group another opportunity to post any questions or comments into the chat. While we're waiting for that, we also have a couple of questions to throw out to the participants and also back to you facilitators. And the first is, and Steve, you made reference to remote monitoring, remote data collection, and how the approach that is being taken in many instances, if not all, is quite different this year as a result of COVID-19. So perhaps I can ask you to comment on challenges that you foresee or that you've heard, you've experienced with remote monitoring and ensuring inclusion of persons with disabilities. Pardon me, it's 5:15 here in Geneva, and I'm starting to lose my ability to speak properly. So challenges that you've heard of, that you foresee on the use of remote monitoring and ensuring inclusion of persons with disabilities. At the same time, I'd encourage anyone out there from the participants to also put in your experiences. It would be very enlightening. But Steve, perhaps I hand this one back to you again, since it's sort of data-centric. Over to you.
Thanks. I just wanted to, I see Claire in the chat has mentioned that HI, Humanity and Inclusion, systematically builds in their needs assessments and planning processes, sort of good data collection processes. And I agree that, if there is a country office, an HI country office in your context, I mean, that's a really excellent first place to look as well. So here we are in COVID, and there's social distancing expectations that really limits how we would have worked previously in previous years with our household surveying. We draw a sample and start knocking on doors. So I've not heard actually of too many large-scale household surveys happening. What I've heard is they're trying to do lighter versions of those, sometimes using telephone surveys. And one of the things that is a limitation for persons with disabilities in engaging in that kind of surveying is that there might be accessibility constraints for persons with disabilities or families that have members who are disabled in engaging in that kind of remote data collection method, just because it takes time longer to maybe get through a question set, and your mobile phone begins to get warm in your ear. But also, if you're hard of hearing, you can't do it that way. So in terms of the COVID situation, really puts a number of constraints in terms of how you draw samples, and how do you make it accessible for people that to ensure that they can participate. It was actually HI that had I thought a clever approach. It wasn't part of one of the large household surveys that are broader in scope and involve a random sample and so on. But one of the approaches that HI did was to use organizations of persons with disabilities to identify key informants amongst the community, people that they knew were facing difficulties of different kinds because of their disabilities. And they sort of did a rapid assessment process, really focused in on individuals that they knew could contribute. And they used the OPDs, the organizations, the local organizations, to help facilitate the process to access people that could speak to some of the risks and barriers that they were facing, some of the limitations they saw with accessing humanitarian assistance and so on. But I would say that in the COVID situation that we have this year, probably through the rest of the 2021 cycle, it's going to be quite challenging for us to figure out workarounds that continue to involve persons with disabilities in the process, so that we can hear from their perspective what the issues are and what can be done to do it better. Over, back to you, Kim.
That's great. Thank you, Steve. I'm going to just quickly, since we do have about 10 minutes left, throw over to see if Claire, since you've had some very interesting examples that you've posted on the chat, I wonder if you would be interested in coming in and expounding a little bit on the approach that HI takes. You noted that that you systematically include this in all of your projects. Perhaps, since we have a few minutes, we could see if you'd be interested in spending a few minutes just telling us a bit more about that.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
We can, yes, Claire.
Okay. Thank you to give me the flow. I don't know what I can tell you more than what you said. We just try to do it systematically in all our projects to get more evidence regarding people with disability, and to have this disaggregated data. Not only to say there is people with disability, but there is different type of people with disability with different needs, and is what we need to understand to better adjust our project, our intervention in the field, to be sure that we can adjust our project and our way of intervention to answer to the need of most of the people in the community. So it will serve the different people with different type of disability, but as well it will benefit to all the population. We use mainly the 6 first question of the Washington group. In Madagascar, we advocate to use the 12 questions, including question on psychological aspect. But it's quite challenging to go through this 12 questionnaire. But at least with in all our projects, we use the 6 first question. And now it's almost, I will not say 100% in 100% of our project, but we tend to do it in all projects to have more evidence and to be able to cross data from country to country. And we work, you mentioned DPOs. As much as possible, we try to work with disabled people organization and to build the capacity, especially to advocate at national level to include Washington group question in the census, national census.
That's very helpful, Claire. Thank you. And I'd urge any of you who may have additional questions for Claire to please post them into the chat as well. Sorry, Claire, I'm making an offer for you, but I hope that's okay. I think there's some important insights and experience to be gained from your work. So I have another question we would throw out to all of you participants, and I will hand over also to the facilitators. So how would you characterize the role of the different clusters, going beyond just the protection cluster in supporting data collection and analysis on disability inclusion? What do you think their role should be? I'll note that we've also got a poll that Ahmed has posted, so I'll encourage you to answer the poll. Oh, sorry, it's closed, but it's being shared. Maybe Ahmed, Kirsten, since I've been handing these to Steve, perhaps I could hand to the two of you. And what do you think the role of the different clusters is in supporting data collection and analysis? While offering those in the participants to also come in, please, through the chat. Over to you.
Ahmed, would you like to start, or what do you prefer?
Go ahead, Kristen, please.
Sure. I mean, I guess the general point I would make is that there's different types of data collection, and different clusters may emphasize data collection for one purpose or another. So what we often find is that there's such a strong focus on the prevalence of persons with disabilities, and there's perhaps less emphasis on collecting data around barriers, for example. So I would say that for all the clusters, it's really important to be collecting data on what are the barriers that people with disabilities face to accessing the type of assistance that they're providing. So the WASH cluster, for example, rather than collecting data on persons with disabilities, like numbers of persons with disabilities, what would be more relevant would be, for example, to do an accessibility assessment of the WASH facilities themselves, or to be collecting data from persons with disabilities on what kind of barriers they're facing to accessing WASH facilities. So that would be more the qualitative type of data. I think the other key point to make, in addition to the point on looking at barriers, is to not only have a focus on quantitative data, but to also really prioritize this qualitative data to be able to get an understanding of, as we keep talking about, the factors that contribute to risk. So for the protection sector particularly, having focus group discussions with key informants, key informant interviews to really understand why is it that persons with disabilities are facing heightened protection risk, for example. Yeah, I mean, they're just general reflections, but Ahmed, I'm sure you have something to add.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you for adding this is very important points, and I will just highlight that it's very important that all cluster is including disability, and the cluster itself could be a very important starting point, either to gathering data but also to have a clear analysis of needs overview and design robust responses that is including person's ability. And disability is not specifically in one cluster as usually happen. Disability is a cross-cutting issue. That means that all the clusters should consider disability within their work. I'm ending pool and then share result with you. This is the result that we have. For the pool, it was very quick one. Actually, it seemed that we have 7 answers that yes, they have been involved in HNO HRP before, and we have nearly 4 that no, but they plan to participate, and the other have not been answering yet. So thank you for the poll and the question. I will back to you, Kim.
Thanks a lot, Ahmed. We have just a few moments left, so I would say this is the last call for questions and comments. This has been an unusually quiet group here today. I can only assume because it's late in the day for some of us, and particularly early in the day for others. Should you end the call, start to work on something else, and find that a question or a thought pops into your head, please, I encourage you to get in touch with any one of us, and we would be happy to engage with you on a discussion on that or to answer your question. We do have something very interesting from Christelle. Do you think the protection coordinator has a specific role to play? If so, which one? Specifically looking at the mine action area of responsibility, there's a particular interest in disability inclusion, given its relationship to explosive ordnance survivors who may not have access to services. So perhaps I will, Ahmed, shall I hand that to
Yeah,
you,
thank you.
the role of the protection coordinator?
Yeah, actually, it's a big role. Yes, protection. We know that protection having a specific cluster, but we should not forget that also protection have what we call it universality of the protection, which means that protection itself is a cross-cutting issue to some extent. That means that the protection should be existing in all cluster. So the protection coordinator is not only covering the protection cluster, but also because of the principle of universality of protection, it's covered a lot. And because that in most of the time, at the example you have given, Crystal, thank you for this vivid example about mine action. It's some type of action that we have facing on humanitarian have a specific connection to disability, either because that it's lead to disability or that person with disability have a specific I will say barriers to access this part, and one of them is mine action, of course. So it's very important because most of the victim of landmine and mine action is actually lead to person is a person with disability. That means that most of the service that we are and the survivor that we wanted to deal with have some sort of disability. That means also we need to give extra attention to this topic. And of course, the protection coordinator could play a huge role, first in the protection cluster itself, and also with other cluster when they are using the universality of protection to ensure that person with disability have an adequate access to service and adequate also do no harm principle. Back to you, Kim.
Thanks a lot for that, Ahmed. And thanks to you, Christelle, for that very insightful comment. We are coming right on to the time at which we had promised to end. Steve has posted a link to SurveyMonkey where we kindly ask you to review how we did today. And note that there will be a post test that is also provided. So we do kindly ask you to complete both of those. They are very, very short. We're talking minutes as opposed to the tens of minutes. So they take into consideration how busy you are and respect your time while offering us some very important information that can help us to continue to improve our performance. My thanks to
Can I just jump in on the link that the SurveyMonkey link in the chat? It really is like 2 questions, and it's sort of like, you know, did we do okay today? We will follow up a little bit later with a separate email with a post test for all the people that took the pre-test. If we do a post test, we have some evidence of whether the training had any impact. So that would be really great if you could fill that out. Back to you, Kim. Sorry for interrupting.
Not at all. That's very helpful, helpful clarity, Steve. So allow me to just thank everyone. Thanks to all of you who came on to participate. We know your time is highly valuable and there are a lot of requests for it. And a special thanks to Stephen, Ahmed, and Kirsten for developing the content, organizing this, and really dedicating an enormous amount of time to this important subject. From my individual and my organizational perspective, I would thank you wholeheartedly. I wish you all good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and we look forward to working with you again in the near future. Take care to everyone. Bye-bye.